Welcome back, everyone. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about labor unions. We'll begin chapter 10 with just a short introduction and a quick look at why people join unions. Now, we may think that unions are a little bit outdated, but after the big longshoreman strike or potential strike just a few months before you're watching this lecture, it's still something that we have to deal with in some situations. There are still quite a few industries where unionization is still prevalent. So we can look at unions just like we did look at individual workers and look at firms. Now, unions are comprised of people, typically many people, but we can analyze them just like we analyze firms. So the unions act in furtherance of their goals, which is the goals of their members. But just like firms, different members within the union may have different individual goals. So if we zoom in and we're looking at all the different individuals within that union, there could be a lot of difference of opinions of what they should do, of what their goals should be. There could even be infighting among the members, tons of little different things going on. But when we zoom out, we can see the organization acting as if they have a singular goal in mind, almost like it's one individual. We have to be careful in our analysis, but just like we did with firms earlier in the semester in this course, we can do the same thing here with unions if we're careful. So in general, we can say that unions want to maximize the well-being of their members. Now, what well-being actually looks like in practice can differ, and that depends partially on institutional context. So things like government regulations, business goals, even cultural norms can shape what the members' interest really is. So, for instance, workers within the union could want higher salaries. That could be their main goal. Maybe they just want stable working hours or shorter working hours. Instead of working 60 hours a week, they want to work 40 hours a week. Or it could be guarantees of employment. They don't want to be fired and rehired at a whim. They want something consistent. The list can go on. There's a lot of different things that they could want, although typically what we look at is wages. Now, unions struggle to exist in environments where there are no profits or no long-term profits. Think of it this way. It's difficult to bargain for higher wages if firms can barely stay afloat. So unions do introduce the sort of extra cost for firms, even if it's just negotiating with unions. Things like that are easier to do when times are better than when money's tight. Your textbook considers unions, and they use this sort of like a metaphor as a way for workers to capture some of the rents or some of the excess profits above what equilibrium would suggest. So when firms earn these rents, these higher profits, it's a way for unions to kind of capture some of that. Some of the best examples and most high-profile examples of unions doing this is when you see the pro sports unions, when the NFL or the NBA, MLB, when they're negotiating these new contracts, because suddenly the say the NBA they get a new TV deal that's worth even more money for them. So the teams are bringing in more money, the league's bringing in more money. The players want some of that, and that's kind of the metaphor that the textbook uses for unionization. Now, I'll save you from having to go through too much of a history lesson. It is important to read through the textbook at least once just to get a kind of an idea of what unionization has been like, but that's not super important for what we're doing here. Um, just looking at the long-term trends here, unionization started to grow in the first half of the 20th century and ends up peaking in about the late 40s, going through the 50s. But then over time, we see a slow decline as manufacturing employment starts to fall, so too does union membership. Meanwhile, membership in public sector unions are strong today. They were legalized by an executive order by Kennedy and then enshrined into law, made permanent in the late 1970s. So we see quite high public sector union membership today. So prior to the Great Depression, the public did not have a particularly favorable opinion on labor unions. A lot of the early labor union like sort of movements had sort of like a violent or militaristic attitude towards them. There were a lot of issues, um, well, frankly, on both sides, some of the firms trying to defend themselves from original unionization, and then the unions themselves being, or groups of workers who wanted to unionize being willing to resort to violence. And in like Pittsburgh, Western PA, all throughout the general Rust Belt, there were violent skirmishes going on. And a lot of times the public tended to blame the unions for that. Employers used what they called yellow dog contracts. Basically, that they would hire someone, but say, if you want to get a job, you have to agree that you will not join a union to protect them. Um, Under the New Deal in the 30s, the federal government policy tended to shift from more negative to more positive towards the union. And they started to enshrine collective bargaining and unionization as an important way to protect workers. And we see there's four major public laws that your textbook goes into a little bit more detail on, passed through the 30s, 40s, and into the 50s. Now, the way union membership works can be thought of as a pyramid, and that's how your textbook describes it. They place the AFL-CIO at the top of the pyramid. The AFL-CIO is the national organization representing most of the unions in the country. They say like 80% of union members fall under the AFL-CIO umbrella. Now, most of the unions under that umbrella are national unions, and they'll represent either a single profession or several related professions in the same industry. Those national unions are typically composed of what we call locals. So they're established at either the city level or in big cities are often done at the plant level. Now, individual unions, either at the national level or at the local level, can choose to engage in negotiations, or they can, even strike or go. Um, they have the ability to decide to take like all of the potential actions. Now, the benefit of being under the AFL-CIO umbrella is that the national organization can coordinate between different related unions, and they can use their purse, the money they get from the union membership, to lobby politicians and to support those unions in their negotiations. Now, we can spend all day talking about exactly how unions function, how the AFL-CIO umbrella works, but that's a little bit less important for a labor economics course. So we'll kind of brush through that as a bit of a setup, and now we're starting to get to working through the models to help understand the decision-making process that goes into a union. But before we look at how unions behave the way they do, we can look at the decision for the individual worker whether or not to join a union. So understanding why workers might choose to join or avoid union membership is central to understanding the influence that unions have on wages, on benefits, job security, workplace policy, all these things. So for employees, joining a union can be a powerful decision. It can increase their bargaining power and lead to better wages or job protections, better long-term benefits, but it can also pose some risks. There are some potential costs. So there's the cost of union dues. There is less flexibility in their employment that we typically see, and there are conflicts of management and potential job losses as a result of those higher wages. So for you guys, I know not all of you are working in HR. I know a lot of my lectures say this because this is in the HR program. Um, but as for those of you who will become HR professionals, that's a better way to say it. Understanding the dynamics and how unions make their decisions will provide some insight into how to best deal with them, whether or if you're like sort of like, I guess, on the union side, case would help you understand when if some of these actions will benefit you or when they will actually ultimately be costly. So in economics, we say that people are rational. Remember, that goes back to our introductory chapter. When we say rational, we don't mean perfect robots. We don't mean that they're always right. We don't mean that they're calculating everything, that everyone's a clone of Spock from Star Trek. What we mean is that they act in their own self-interest as they see it. So in this case, someone or a worker will compare the costs and the benefits of joining a union. Now, most of this won't be sitting down with a list of pros on one side, cons on the other, and trying to come up with a number for each and adding up all the numbers. Not like that. But a lot of this is really implicit when we consider these choices. So a worker will not join a union if they think that the benefits of joining that union are going to be less than the cost of joining that union. Now, before we get too in the weeds, it's important to note that peer pressure or solidarity with your friends and coworkers could very easily be a benefit to consider. Not everything is money. I know it's weird hearing an economist say that, but when it comes to these individuals deciding whether to do something, considering the costs and the benefits, there are plenty of things that we can't put a dollar figure on easily that really are essential to the decision, really. Now, where the interesting part comes in this thinking is about what's going on with firms. So for workers, okay, as long as the potential wage gains are above like union dues, as long as your friends won't hate you if you join it or hate you if you don't join it, if you don't think you'll lose your job, you'll choose to join the union. That's pretty straightforward. But once we start thinking about how firms will react, that's where this gets interesting. So firms don't sit on a Scrooge McDuck style vault of gold with all this extra money they can pay workers. Now they may have some flexibility, but they don't have a ton of extra money sitting around to spend on higher wages. So if the union is able to get workers higher wages, it will come at the cost of the firm hiring fewer workers. So if the firm's demand for labor is inelastic, meaning that it's not very responsive to a change in wages. If wages change, they won't fire a lot of workers or hire a bunch of workers. Then union membership won't have a big effect on the number of workers employed. So you can imagine a hospital where the nurses unionize. Hospitals aren't in the position to replace nurses with machines, and there's no other forms of capital that can really replace the humans delivering the care. So they won't really be sensitive to a change in wages. They need to pay nurses more if nurses want if they collectively bargain to ask for more money. They're kind of stuck. So in this case, unionization will be very beneficial for workers, and they're not facing significant costs, significant you know reductions in employment. But on the other hand, if firms are sensitive to a change in wages, then unionizations will decrease employment. So think of it this way: if a fast food restaurant union demands higher wages and the restaurant caves, they can replace a lot of those workers with ordering kiosks. It's very easy for them to do. So the workers that still have their job will earn higher wages, but we'll see a significant decrease in the number of workers hired. So it becomes, for the individual worker deciding whether or not to join the union, something that has to enter their mind is whether the union is, if they are able to get those wage increases, how will the firm react? Will the firm react by cutting a lot of workers, or will they be unable to? So there's this need to think about what kind of position the firm is in to know whether or not unionization will be beneficial for an individual worker. So here we have our old friend, our labor leisure choice model. I'm sorry for bringing this back up. Hopefully, this is just kind of a quick, intuitive model to help us look at the decision-making process. Unfortunately, this model contains two potential situations. Your textbook loves to combine graphs to be as efficient as possible. I guess it saves on like 20 cents of ink, like per textbook, but it does come with the cost of being able to see it clearly. So let's say without the union present, suppose the firm is willing to pay a wage rate of W star. So that's this curve right here, AT. That's the original budget constraint for the worker. So where does the worker choose to work in this graph? It's where their indifference curve, which is represented by U here, this curve, is tangent to that line, so at point P. So the best thing for this worker is to engage in L star hours of leisure, which corresponds to H hours of work. That's where they're at initially. So what happens if union organizers decide to target the firm for a new employment contract? So new employment contract with higher wages. If the target wage is wage WU, there's a wage union, we can represent it by this line. It's higher than the original line, so it's kind of rotated. At T here, it crosses the x-axis at the same exact spot, but it goes up and reaches a higher point. So this point, in this case, point B. So BT is the new budget line, and that slope is the higher wage. But this higher wage comes at a cost. There's a risk that the firm could reduce employment in order to keep their costs down. Remember, because firms produce at the level of output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, if the firm, if their marginal costs increase, if their wages increase, they'll either have to reduce the number of workers that they hire to keep that marginal cost the same, or find a way to make more money to increase their marginal revenue, which is more of a long-term issue than something they could do in this decision-making situation. So if the firm is sensitive to changes in wages, what will happen? They will end up reducing the hours as a result of the wage change. But if they're sensitive to wage changes, it's going to be a large reduction. So let's say we move from H star here all the way down to H0, where that crosses the budget line for the worker, for the new budget line, is going to be right here at point P0. The point here is that it's on a lower indifference curve. It's closer to the origin. So that worker's utility is going to decrease. Expecting this will happen, the worker would not want to join a union or would not want the existing union to push for the wage increase. Now, of course, the worker isn't going to look at these curves to make this decision. But likely what's going on in their mind is thinking, okay, there's no way that they're going to be able to keep us all. They're going to have to fire a bunch of us or cut all of our hours. There's no way we're going to win from this. So they won't want to join the union or they won't want to engage in a strike. But on the other hand, if the firm is less sensitive to a price change, maybe instead of reducing the hours to H0, they reduce the hours to H1 down here. At this point, that will cross the worker's budget line right up here at point P1. That's on a higher indifference curve than the original point P. This higher indifference curve represents a greater amount of utility. Basically, this worker is better off. In this case, when the worker is better off, they'll be more likely to join the union and want the union to negotiate this higher contract. So what I want you to take away from this is that when workers are less likely to be laid off, when they get greater utility, they're more likely to join the union. But it depends on what the firm's decision is going to be. If the firm is likely to fire a bunch of workers to reduce their headcount to try to reduce their labor costs, workers will be more skeptical of joining a union or be more hesitant to push for a new contract and for a wage increase. Now, like I said, whether people want to join a union depends on the benefits and the cost of the membership. Now, firms are treating employees very poorly, difficult working conditions, low wages. The union can provide significant benefits. If the workers at the beginning are being treated well and they earn good wages, it's a lot more difficult for unions to see more. The potential benefit that they can offer is much smaller than if, conditions and wages are worse. But even when there is room for unions, the potential job losses, how firms are going to react, influence the worker's decision. Something else that it depends on, and this is less relevant today, but in the United States, but a lot more important in the past, is whether unions have legal protection and whether they have the ability to negotiate or collectively bargain and to even go on strike. Without this, unionization is difficult and it's extremely costly to do and unlikely to result in any benefits. There's an old movie starring Sean Connery about the Molly Maguires. Basically, it's about a bunch of coal miners in Eastern PA back in the 1870s. They tried to start a union, or they tried to start a union because there were high potential benefits. So that's why they wanted to. But they lacked this second part, that legal recognition of collective bargaining, and the union foundered, it fell apart, it wasn't able to bargain. And that's kind of the setup for this movie. So while this isn't really an issue today, it was a consideration in the past. Now, let's briefly consider why is union membership declined. So we can see that if firms are likely to lay off a bunch of workers, workers will be less likely to join a union. But that doesn't fully explain what's going on here. What's important to know is that the structure of the labor market has been changing since the 1960s. There's a lot less blue-collar workers. Manufacturing is a lot less important. I say not in terms of output, but in terms of the number of workers being hired. This is a really important cause of the decline in union membership. So it's not so much that some sort of change in this right here for the individual workers' decision making. It's that there are fewer workers in those professions where in the past it made sense or is beneficial. Now there have been some jobs shifting to right to work states. So in those states, make it more difficult to join a union. So not quite like the example of coal miners in the 1860s and 1870s, like I was talking about, but a little bit more difficult. Something I think is really important is the post-World War II manufacturing boom. That was, I think, someone that was a huge driver. We had very little international competition for manufactured goods, and that really protected the manufacturing industry for a few decades. Your textbook talks about marked increase in labor force participation rate for women as women because women are less likely to work in union professions or join unions. But honestly, the difference isn't that considerable. It's like I think 11% of men and 10% of women. So I don't know if that's a huge, huge driver. And there have been some issues. Workers' demand for union jobs have declined, but I think most of that is due to the structure of the labor market and the reduction in manufacturing employment. And firms have become more resistant to unions. There was a lot of high-profile union corruption in like the 70s and the 80s, and some of that has tainted labor unions with kind of a negative view among among firms and the general public. So look for the union label was a real big thing for several decades, but now they're starting to, they're not starting to, they have been viewed a little bit more negatively. And that can be, a considerable cost for union membership and give firms more desire to fight against them, let's say. So I've been going on pretty long. I will end this lecture here and we will pick up with some of the more interesting models of how unions actually behave.